The main resource that a lot of this is based off of is the Legal Aid Technology Toolkit that was done by the Michigan Advocacy Program and Idealware as part of an LSC grant. And a direct link to that PDF. It's about a 40-page PDF that goes over the basics of privacy information security is in the chat. It will also be sent as a resource on email afterwards. This particular program is being put on by Eastside Legal Assistance Project as part of a contracting grant with Legal Foundation of Washington. Thank you so much for the support for this. A little bit of background about me as the speaker. I've taught information privacy law at Seattle U and information ethics at UW's Information School. I used to be a Google Public Policy Fellow out at Public Knowledge. And for about 8 years, I ran a program called Legal Services National Technology Assistance Project, which worked on teaching legal aid organizations how to use new technology, help them write grants, deal with things like privacy and security of data that's out there. And that was housed by Northwest Justice Project. I am now over at Eastside Legal Assistance Project. My new email address is there, and I'm putting it into the chat. Sorry, at elap.org. I am available to help on help desk type items, strategic items, ranging from legal server to privacy, security, how to find images that are able to be used for social media, anything on tech and access to justice. I can definitely help with those things. So feel free to email me. I've just gotten settled in at ELAP, started there at the beginning of the year, and super happy to be working with them. We've got a great group of people over there. Um, Before we get into kind of the practical technical stuff, I'm going to give a little bit of background over privacy law in the US. Usually I do not recommend reading law review articles to do anything except try to cure insomnia, but this is actually an extremely good law review article. It's Warren and Brandeis, The Right to Privacy, and it is the foundation of privacy rights in the US. Within this article, it discusses the advancement of technology, and they're talking about cameras there in 1890, but it is so relevant to today and how technology is taking over everything, recording everything, and making things available that were private before the advent of technology. One of the other pieces that I recommend checking out is the basics of privacy torts here in the United States. It is Prosser's privacy article for 1960. It really identifies four: intrusion upon seclusion, disclosure of private facts, putting someone in a false light, and appropriation, which is commercial use. Mostly what we're looking at, though, in the privacy realm now is the intrusion into your private space or disclosing of private facts. In the legal context, RPC 1.6 is your duty of confidentiality to your clients. And zooming in here just on the intro, the most important part here is that unless the client gives informed consent or the disclosure is implied, authorized to carry out your representation, you have a duty to keep that information private. And informed consent is really the important part there. Yes, there are some carve-outs for things like if someone is going to commit a crime, but the default is that all the information that our clients give us is confidential unless you have that informed consent or must use it with regards to your representation. The EU is actually well ahead of the US with regards to creating affirmative rights of privacy. The General Data Protection Regulation out there is being mirrored in some ways here in the US. We have new laws in California that look at these things, but they really look at privacy as more of an affirmative right for individuals. In some cases, you have the right to even be forgotten in certain situations. but the basic rights to be able to view your information, ask for your information to be updated and corrected, and have access to that, are making it into U.S. law also. But this isn't going to be focused purely on the legal side. This is more focused on the practical side for individuals running organizations. The first thing that I really recommend is looking at what threat modeling is and risk assessment. What are some of the types of threats that you think are out there where individuals could get access to your information? Feel free to type those into the box here, into the chat box, of ways that you are likely to lose confidential information or for that to become disclosed publicly, or even you losing access to it. What do you think are some of the most common threats to the organization and to that data? So the major ones out there right now are definitely malware. Yep. We've got lost hardware or carelessness with regards to files. That's a huge part of it. Hacking, email or case management systems. Yep. Most of the malicious software comes through email at this point, 92%. There's been a few legal aid organizations and a significant number of government organizations that have been targeted by ransomware. In 2018 alone, ransomware was up 350%. A lot of it is also social engineering. Someone will create a similar address or spoof an email address and pretend to be someone inside your organization, asking for a request for information or asking for a check or other things like that. Most of the causes are negligence in not having things properly secured or locked down. That's almost 2 times more common than hackers, and 10 times more common than having someone inside of an organization maliciously doing something. In the legal aid context, someone internally doing something malicious is very, very uncommon. But even in the private sector, that internal malicious actor is only about 1 in 20 of the incidences that are out there. So it's more a situation of training employees, letting them know how to deal with phishing scams or other things, and locking down your systems and putting the proper permissions in place. Most 75% is related to those things that are pretty preventable, where it's not an intentional attack inside or outside. How have things changed with regards to COVID? Cyber attacks using malware, especially on people's home computers, is up 15%, 75%, or sorry, 47% of individuals working from home are falling for phishing scams via emails. The number of attacks on video conferencing services such as Zoom and others has been gigantic in last year. They've been a primary target. Zoom, who we are using today, was hit with several attacks in March, April, and May of last year and has done major upgrades on their security system to combat these and is continuing to do upgrades. So these types of software that we've all been moving to work from home have been the largest targets, and people's home computers is much higher to be targeted now than they were even a year ago. So how do we practically try to deal with this? The first thing that I recommend, and that the report that I mentioned earlier, which I'm dropping in, it's actually a really practical toolkit with a bunch of forms to fill out, questions to ask about your organization, which is the Legal Aid Technology Toolkit for Security. The first thing they recommend is going through a data inventory and document the types of data that you have how much you care about it, how much it needs to be kept private, and what is the consequences and what would you do if that information was disclosed or leaked. Let's take a minute and have individuals type in a few of the different types of data that they have in their organizations. And don't just think about client data, but also some information that may be more readily shared or available, different things that you have there. Donor data, that is a huge one. Employee social security numbers, any payroll data, very, very large. Yes. HR data and how you control access to HR data is a huge one. Um, Both on the donor and on the HR side, those type of security links really have the huge chance to lose confidence in your organization there. Any other types of data that individuals can think of? So, in my first few weeks at ELAP, we did a short inventory of some of the different types of data that are available. This is a partial list of things that we came up with, but it includes things like text messages from clients, contracts that we have, releases for information, passwords, uh, credit card and checking information that is used, donor list, which was mentioned here. Your Wi Fi login is one of those, although many of us are not in the office currently. Payroll. Do you have any data that is covered by HIPAA? Do you have a medical legal partnership as part of that? What standards are you using there? Documents and drafts circulated with your board. This is often a big one, as there is you've got a duty to get certain information to your board. Some of that information may need to be confidential. Others is going to become public record, meeting minute notes, other things like that. Something that's going to become public record has a very different standard than something that needs to be kept confidential. If you reach out and get ethics opinions as to how you should be running your organization, do you keep that internal or external? CLEs are recordings that you have. Maybe that was something that was publicly available, but it was targeted only at the consumer advocates, and maybe that's not something that you necessarily want shared with the debt collection bar or with opposing parties. So even though it was public, maybe it's not something you want to keep public. Attendance logs from events. For grant reporting, you often need to report some information, but the information you collect may be more than is needed to report. Do you keep that additional data? Do you remove that data? Do you only keep what is required for grant reporting? Your case management system, whether it's Legal Server or Clio or something else, also has an incredible amount of data along with the reports that are pulled out of that. So after you've got that data of inventory, you want to go back and take each of those pieces and look at each of the different factors that are here. What could happen to it? How could people get access to it? What is the consequences of that? And then most importantly, how do you respond? So if your donor data is leaked, do you have a process for letting donors know about this? If the credit card payment data for renewing your bar fees happens to be compromised, how long does it take you to notify all the members of the state bar that has happened and replace those credit cards? And then once you have data, how long do you keep data? At one point in time when we worked with physical files, there was a storage limit to how much information you could keep in your office. Today, that doesn't exist. A 20 terabyte hard drive costs almost nothing. You could keep data forever. I strongly, strongly recommend not keeping data forever. In fact, not keeping data beyond when it has a legitimate business purpose or you're required to. When it comes to having your data hacked, it's eventually going to happen. Eventually, a hard drive is going to be compromised or it's not going to be wiped correctly when recycled. But someone can only get access to the information that is on that drive if you have removed data, or if you removed all data that's over 7 years old, or if you've removed data from closed cases where it's no longer relevant, then that data can't be lost. From a security perspective, you should only be keeping the data that you need and not keeping everything. And the um, habit in law is to keep everything forever. In fact, even inside of our case management system that most of us are using, Legal Server, it's extremely difficult to delete case data. You actually have to go to Legal Server currently. But if you've got a 10 or 12-year-old case, is there really any legitimate business purpose to that case, especially if it doesn't involve a will or trust? Most of those cases, it is a liability to keep those around. And that's one of the things that I'm definitely discussing with Legal Server, is how can data destruction be done safely and securely to help prevent that data from getting out. There are some cases, IOLTA and trust funds are one of those in which you have a hard requirement to keep it. I'm not going to go into all of the particulars. You could do an entire webinar on this. And if you have trust fund data, I would definitely reach out to the bar and read the guide that they've got online. It's very detailed in the type of accounting and the type of time that is needed for it, although many of us in legal aid do not end up needing to deal with that. The next thing is who has access to a particular piece of data. How do you set up permissions? Does everybody who has access to Legal Server get to see everything, or do they only get to see their cases? Does someone who runs conflicts checks look at things differently, or intake have different levels of control? Um, the important part with any type of data that you're keeping is limiting access to only the people that need it. So, for example, we talked about payroll data. Your accountant clearly needs access to it. You should have someone else there who has access to it. But once the legitimate business purpose of some of those things are done, does other staff member, does the director of operations, does the executive director, who else needs access to that information, and then make sure that those are the only people who have access. Volunteers is a very interesting case, and we've been dealing with this some at ELAP, as we used to have volunteers that came in and worked in our case management system from on site, and now that we are working distributively, we are not comfortable giving them the same direct access that they would have had while they were inside the office entering stuff for us. And we're deciding how to re-engage volunteers remotely and what their access should be. Additionally, if a volunteer is working on a personal computer from home, are there particular standards that are set up for that? Is there a requirement for some type of a virus protection in place, that their computer is updated and patched? Is that checked in any way? It's one thing when you're distributing laptops or surfaces that you manage and check in on those things regularly. It's another thing in working with volunteer computers or associates' computers. Determining the amount of access that someone should have needs to take into account the hardware, the situation, whether there's oversight to them. Consultants are often given access to shared files or other things, and how long do they have that access? Is there a confidentiality agreement with that company or with that outside consultant? We're working with a outside counsel over some ethics issues, and we've got a agreement put together with them. But additionally, when they no longer need access to particular files, we'll pull those from our file sharing site, which really talks about some basic policies that individuals should have in place. And I This is a model confidentiality policy that was developed a few years ago and then refined last year for volunteers that are working with you. It's simple, short, easy to read, mentions the confidentiality, and also encourages individuals to err in favor of treating information as confidential if they are unsure and asking for help from the executive director or from a privacy officer. I'd like to pause here for a second to see if there are any questions, anything that anybody has before we move on here and talk about privacy officers. One thing that I strongly recommend that your organization do, no matter what the size is, I mean, if it's a one-person organization, it's going to be the person in charge. But once you get up to 5 or more people, is put someone in your organization. Maybe that's your IT director. Maybe that's your director of operations. Maybe if you're large enough, it's someone who just deals in privacy. Although that's pretty uncommon in legal services, it's very common in smaller startups and technology companies. And this person should have, as part of their work, a regular check-in on privacy-related policies, be able to ask questions that anybody who has, whether it's a volunteer or a staff member, how should we deal with this data? This person should be the go-to person for privacy-related questions. And they may not know the answer. In fact, most of us, without particular privacy training, are not going to know the answer. But they're going to have resources that are available. Maybe it's a good working relationship with the bar association over privacy things. Maybe it's outside counsel through a local firm that deals with privacy. There are organizations out there that will also do research for you on privacy related issues for being a nonprofit and get back to you a legal memo on how to deal with that information. But there should be a go-to person that collects this information and starts to become an expert in privacy. We've got a great question here. In light of the RPCs, do you recommend that volunteer attorneys also sign a confidentiality agreement with a volunteer lawyer program? So I think when it comes to volunteer attorneys, it depends on what they're doing. If you are wholesale handing the case to them, I still think it's a good idea, but not necessarily required. But some of the information that you're sharing with them may be used for like conflict checks or billing or other things. And I do recommend having a basic policy in place there. But it also shows that you're taking it seriously and that they are also any volunteer outside of an attorney 100%. But what the RPCs require is not necessarily the same as what best practices or what should be done. The RPCs are really a minimum requirement in order to keep your license. And you may have policies or recommendations that are stronger than what the RPCs say that you would want to communicate to or discuss with someone. Once a volunteer lawyer has taken on a client, they're going to be responsible for that confidentiality, and they may make different decisions based on their duty under the RPCs. So there may be some conflicts occasionally between a recommended best practice for an organization and how a particular lawyer interprets their duties under the RPCs also. But it sets a norm, though, also of cognizant of what this information is and how important it is. Privacy officers, I would also recommend and encourage them to get privacy-related training. I've got 2 different trainings listed here on the website. One of the, or on the slides. One of them is a free training that we put together with Roundtable Technology out of New York in 2017. It's a 6 to 8 part series of 30-minute short videos. They range from the basics of network security to phishing and email to social media, and they're aimed at nonprofit organizations understanding the basics. They are free. I'm going to drop the link to those videos and a short quiz. The individuals who did this have come up with a much more robust program since then that includes some certifications and tests. But as an intro for a free resource, this is a great short series of videos that cover the basics. Your gold standard in privacy related trainings are IAPP trainings, and there's really two to look at in the privacy realm. If you want to become an expert on privacy related laws and compliance, it's the Certified Information Privacy Professionals certificate that's out there. And if you're designing systems, the Privacy Program Management. These are both things that I would recommend. A lot of your consultants in the privacy related space will have one or both of these certifications depending on what they're doing. And if you look at somebody for an outside security audit or privacy audit of your organization in some way, these are the certifications that you're going to be looking for. There is a cost, there is a test. It does take a pretty good amount of studying to make it through the test, but it really hits on a lot more in depth, both the legal rules that are out there, but also the best practices and how to handle or design with privacy and security at the forefront of what you're doing. When having data and information, make sure that you have at least two people that have access to that data. Especially in smaller organizations, individuals set up a email list or a donor management system, or access to some client files, and then they're the only person that has access. If a tragedy happens, if someone quits quickly or is fired, this is the most common way that access to data and information is lost. So make sure that all information, whether it's your domain name register or your client case management system or your shared files, that you have at least two people who have access to any of that. I would create a spreadsheet of all of the different types of data that we showed earlier, and include in that who is primarily responsible, who is the backup person, and then additionally, who else has access? Maybe it's the whole legal staff. Maybe it's the development team or the communications team. Maybe it's the organization widely. And then put together a practice for onboarding. When somebody new comes on the organization, you can look at that spreadsheet and create off that spreadsheet a checklist of what information they need access to so that they get a list of that and you're granting them permissions. Onboarding goes a lot slower if you give somebody access to your case management system and then they just got to wait to kind of request or know whatever other resources are out there. You also end up, from a practical perspective, of having multiple tools that will do the same thing. Many organizations I've looked at might have 2 or 3 different ways to collect online forms because somebody in development has put something together, somebody in intake for clients has put something together, and then a volunteer put something together for a one-off website. And having those multiple systems often costs the organization a monthly fee, makes it more difficult to track information, and similar information may even be kept in different ways. questions aren't standardized, and it makes it very difficult to later do reporting or collect information into one spot. So having that master list is useful both as a technology management, but also for keeping access and security in mind. And then put together an offboarding process. When your summer interns are done, you remove their access to the case management system. You remove their access via your password manager to all passwords. You remove their access to the timekeeping system. And you go through and double check all of those. Are there shared files? Are those Google files? Are they OneDrive? Or are they Box? And have you remove that access? That lingering access, if that person's account gets hacked later, they then have access into your files, and cleaning that up. Additionally, I would recommend, and I'm going to recommend this a few times throughout this, is have some type of occasional auditing process in place to make sure that this is being done correctly. Check in with your new individuals, but also check in after all the interns are gone, a few weeks later, and spot check a few. Were they actually removed from Box? Or maybe somebody was left on because they were closing out a project and they didn't meet the normal deadline to be removed. One of the most practical things that I can recommend for onboarding, for offboarding, for any of these process is create a checklist. And checklists sound really simple. I recommend the book Checklist Manifesto. It's really set in the medical field, and it talks about how simple checklists have empowered people at different levels, whether they're medical assistants, nurses, doctors, to check each other over things and have a verified way to make sure that things are being done correctly. Checklists are useful in law when it comes to case management and pleadings, but it's also extremely useful when it comes to security. And then verify those checklists, audit those checklists. Checklists need to be short, preferably 1 page or less, plain language, the least number of words possible. All of this is covered inside the book of how to make them useful, and they need to be tested by people who didn't write them. So if you write a checklist on the offboarding procedure, you need to give it to somebody else as if you are no longer in charge of this and have somebody else run through it. Because our brains are very sympathetic to the things that we create. And we'll read steps in or clarification into those checklists that aren't actually there. Testing it with a volunteer or somebody outside your organization is another great way to make sure that it's clear. This makes succession planning so much easier when someone takes over a position, and it works really well with security. Password management is one of the biggest areas where data is leaked. I strongly recommend using a password manager for whoever keeps track of passwords in your organizations, one that can share. With regards to passwords, password managers will create strong passwords for them and keep them for you. All password managers have two-factor authentication. If you're creating passwords yourself, passphrases is the way to go. A series of words that doesn't necessarily make sense. A longer password is better than a shorter, more complicated-looking password. The two options that I've got here for password managers, LastPass, the free version of it allows individuals to accept an unlimited number of passwords from others and store an unlimited number of passwords themselves. I require all volunteers and outside individuals that I work with to set up a free account of LastPass, and then if I'm going to share passwords with them, I share it via LastPass. And then when they're done volunteering, I can go back into my premier version of LastPass and remove access to them. It makes it really, really easy to see who has access to what, to add and remove. The reason I recommend LastPass is that for someone to set up an account that they can receive shared passwords, it's free. Your admin, in order to share with more than one person, does need a paid account. That's about $5 a month. It's very easy to set up. It has a mobile application that will also work on your phone and has two-factor authentication. If everyone you're working with is going to have a premium account that has that more sharing options and other rich features, Dashline actually costs less per individual license because there's a TechSoup discount. The free version has a lot less features. I recommend LastPass for free, but Dashline is very, very good. The Premier version is as good or has some different features from LastPass, but the TechSoup discount does make it less expensive than giving everyone a LastPass account. Common password mistakes is sharing passwords in plain text, sharing the password and the username in the same email, making people change passwords. This is one of the things that really irks me about the Copyright Office. The Copyright Office still makes you update and change your password regularly. Many security settings do. It's no longer a recommendation to make people change passwords again and again and again. And it creates a huge havoc for IT trying to help people when they've forgot their new password because they've had to change it every 3 months. The recommendation is to now have a single different password for each site. And then if there's a data breach, you're only giving up that one site and you change that site. But changing regularly is not as helpful as having two-factor authentication. And I'll go into two-factor authentication a little bit later. Another thing that individuals need to think about is that this is not all cyber. It is also how are your physical files laid out in your office? Is your shredder access to documents that need to be shredded or destroyed? Are those locked? Are your legal files in locking cabinets or behind a locking door? Are there people who would have access to where those file cabinets are, and are they kept secure? In the world of working from home, these things also need to be thought about with regards to the home office. Are you providing locking file cabinets or locking case boxes? Some of our counties, we do everything digital. Others, we have to print working copies out and still walk them into the courthouse. Yes, Snohomish County currently has e-filing, but they have physical working copies still. If people are using a printer at home, drafts that are not used, what happens to those? A cross-cut shredder is the recommendation. Instead of having somebody tear those up or throw those away themselves, providing those basic tools for somebody at home is as important as making sure they have virus protection or that you're providing them the proper other materials. Updates, patches, and virus protection. Have a plan in place to make sure that updates and patches and virus protection is all done. Inventory all of the items that you have and all the bring your own devices that individuals are using so that you've got a list of all of the devices that your organization data could be on. And audit yearly. Choose some of those devices. Make sure that updates are being done regularly, that the virus protection is there and working. It's often not until there's a problem that individuals figure out that the system wasn't working. It's worth it to stake out a day or two every year to do those audits to catch problems early, then run into them later. When purchasing devices, A lot of different organizations go in different manners. Some people give out a stipend and let people purchase whatever they want. Other organizations try to use similar or same devices. From an IT perspective, it's much easier to update, deal with drivers, deal with hardware if people have similar or same devices across the board. Um, it it's definitely a recommendation, but each organization deals with those things differently. If you are managing the computers and running out updates, patches, that type of stuff yourself, run it on a test machine first before throwing it out to the entire organization, especially with software updates that could break that particular piece of software for a period of time. That 20, 30 minutes spent testing it on one computer saves you an entire day of um, recovery and dealing with people not being able to work if it doesn't work. A reminder from LFW, if programs need Shredder, LastPass, things like that, there are LFW funds that you can apply for grant support for those unexpected costs. That's great to know. Having the availability to cover those expenses. Um, with the inventory list, the private devices definitely need to be on there. Additionally, make sure that those private devices have some way to remotely wipe them if lost, if client data is on there. Uh, if a phone has Outlook installed as an app, there's a remote wipe option there. iPhones also through the carrier have remote wipe options. But making sure that you have a way, even on private devices, that if lost or stolen, you can remove that data is essential. Backups. Most organizations have either a physical backup or some type of a cloud backup tool. It is recommended to have both. If you have a natural disaster that affects your office workspace and your physical backups are there, you often lose them. If your cloud service provider has a problem and you don't have any backups of your own, then you are also out of luck. Having those in two different locations from a disaster recovery perspective is extremely helpful. Uh, just like your patches and your virus protection, this should be tested at least yearly. I mean, to give you a little bit of background, when I was at LSNTAP, within the first 6 months of being at the Legal Services National Technology Assistance Project, the whole website went down, and the cloud service provider that we were using, basically their backups did not work at all. We ended up having to grab stuff off of Internet Archive, find things that were publicly cached. The site had never been tested in backups in the 8 years before I had gotten there, and it just happened to crash right after I got there. So whether it's your case management files that are stored in Box, make sure that you can actually restore them. Having the hard drive and downloading them sounds like it's enough, but if it doesn't work to reload those later, it's a nightmare. The recovery time for organizations that test these things on a regular basis is 1/10 than organizations that do not test their backups. Maybe their backups are there, but they're inaccessible, or they're going to need an expert and a few days to get to them. Make sure it's easy and accessible. As mentioned, just schedule it in. I've scheduled for August for ELAP to do some recovery and backup. Although I'm testing individual systems as I discover them in the organization to see what is stored there. More important than having a complicated password is having multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is basically You have your password, and then you have something else that is needed to access, at least the first time, if not on a semi regular basis. So, for example, my password plus my thumbprint, or my password plus it calls my cell phone, gives me a code, and then I enter that code, or my password plus a USB key in order to access something. This makes it so that if your password is compromised, they still can't get into your system, especially from a new device. Most of the multi-factor systems out there will also notify you when a new device is added. You'll get an email, which is a nice feature. So you can say, oh, no, I wasn't in Paraguay recently. I need to change my passwords and set up better security on this account. Having done social media for several years, this just happens. Um, Once enough people find out who you are, you will have people try to hack and take this information. It could also just be people who scraped a website, found your email address, and are trying some common passwords to get into whatever information they can find out there. So, great question here. Do I recommend multi-factor authentication for all programs or only certain programs? Um, it really comes down to the sensitivity of the data that is being stored somewhere, or what the impact could be. So, for example, for Twitter, if somebody gets a hold of your Twitter and starts sharing an online intake form that asks for personal information for an upcoming clinic that doesn't exist, and they're taking that information, the potential impact could be gathering a lot of individuals' information, and somewhat of a loss of trust also. So I would recommend it. Um, in most cases, I recommend multi-factor authentication. If it's to make it easier on staff, though, if it's related to a device that you have, only having them re-verify on a monthly or semi-regular basis, um, as long as they're not doing things like storing the password on a post-it note on the device. Like that, as long as they're someone is not likely able to get into it if just the device is taken. The UB keys are one that I recommend if you're dealing with high sensitivity data. It's basically a thumb drive that you plug into your computer. So you enter your password, you enter the thumb drive, and then you can access it. Most programs, though, are not actually storing the case-sensitive data on their computer. They're storing it in Box or OneDrive, or some type of a remote system that needs access. So if the device is stolen, there's less data that is there to be taken. Social media logins and social logins. I caution against these. They are the easiest to use to set up new accounts. Everybody uses them. There are two big drawbacks. Number one is that they track your use and your information. You use this login for Gravity payments or some other online payment service. Next thing you know, you're going to be getting ads in your social media about this. Second, when you create an account that is hooked up to a social media account, it makes transferring that account and that admin access and that information very difficult when someone leaves an organization. There is a way with Google accounts to associate your professional account with your personal account and then unassociate it later, which would be the best practice, but nobody does it. Or a small number of people do that. They end up just using their personal account, which is not a good idea. Mixing that client data into a personal account is almost never recommended. I would recommend for most systems, use your work-related email, set up a specific account for it that is not connected to a social login. I wish there was a great OpenID system. I know there's something called OpenID, but it's just not adopted broadly. There isn't one of these that doesn't have the ad sharing, the culling through your personal data, and that is really easy to use at this point or widely accepted. And I know most organizations probably have a bunch of accounts set up under social accounts, and it could take some time and effort to change some of those. If you're using something like Canva that just lets you create social media graphics, it's not a big deal. But if you're using something that keeps client data, then it's a much bigger deal. So think about the particular tools also, and how sensitive the data is within those tools before using a social login and sharing that information. Text messaging is one of the most popular ways for clients to communicate with lawyers. I know some lawyers who just don't do it at all. Over the last year, I did it a lot when I was with my own nonprofit. And at ELAP, several of our lawyers do. Making sure that these text messages are sent securely is really important. I've got two applications here that are highly recommended, WhatsApp and Signal. They're both great. WhatsApp is used a little more in the international community, but they both have really good security standards. Additionally, having a way to back those up, you can text message or send some of those things directly to Legal Server to show up as case notes. You can also download them using a program like iMazing or SMS Backup and Restore for Android. I recommend putting together some type of monthly or bi-monthly training for your staff that's short, not as long as this, but goes over some things like phishing, security, password management, different things like that. 20, 30 minutes. If organizations are interested in that, I am available to help with that through the current program and to help answer questions for staff or do a training specific to a particular organization. EFF has the best resources for how to wipe a laptop, how to wipe a hard drive, how to remove user data, how to use WhatsApp or other programs safely. It's ssd.eff.org. It's their surveillance self-defense. They are security experts who have written really easy how-to guides on how to do these things. Opening it up at this point because we've got about 5 minutes left for any questions that individuals have on any topic. Well, I wait for questions here. I am going to be setting up once every 2 weeks some office hours where individuals can just drop by and ask any questions that are available or that you have. Also, I know that a lot of programs have some challenges with Legal Server. I've just been doing a bunch of trainings with Legal Server, and Legal Server has weekly office hours, but I'm available to help with Legal Server related stuff. So does Teams have protection? So first, Teams uses your same login and can be set up admin-wise to have the same levels of security as your email or anything else. They do use encryption by default. Teams is a safe place to put things. Another question here. Do you recommend not using Gmail logins and Google Drive? So no. I do recommend using Gmail and Google Drive or Google Enterprise. I used Google for 3 of the 6 nonprofits that I've worked at in the last 10 years. What I don't recommend is using your personal Gmail for accessing files that are on a Google Drive that is related to confidentiality or other things. Is setting up and making sure you have a login related to your work email specifically and doing that. But Google definitely uses same high quality standards, and can be set in from an admin side to have multi-factor authentication, notifications if somebody's logging in from a remote place, those type of things. Controlling access to files. If somebody creates a file inside your organization and then leaves the organization, you may lose access to those. So I recommend that people in the organization be the one to create files and then let others who need access have permission to edit or change those things. We're running up near the end here. Other questions? I'm dropping all three of these resources into the link box that is available into the chat box. So there was a question here: are there vendors that we can hire to do a security audit, make and do recommendations? Yes, there are. Let me make a note to put together a list of those, because I worked with several of them at LSNTAP of different sizes. And there are some firms locally that specialize in that type of stuff. I can do very basic, but you want somebody who it's their specialty to do it. I will be sending a link to the recordings out. Also, we are starting an email list, actually. And this email list here is going to be a community resource where individuals can ask questions. Myself, interns that I have, other people working on the project will also be available to answer questions. But the idea is to create a community of individuals here in the Northwest where we can say, hey, I'm doing an online clinic. What technologies are you using? Or we're doing digital signatures and we just hit our limit on DocuSign. Is there something that might be more cost efficient? Or how do we use templates to use this more efficiently and that we can share things? I will be sending out to the group some information about subscribing to that. And the idea is that we can help each other answer questions and share best practices. I will send a link to the recording and an edited version probably up on our YouTube channel here within the next week or so. Also, please feel free to email me any follow-up questions, whether it relates to security, privacy, basic technology, strategic stuff for larger projects, or things related to legal server. I'm available to help out with all of those things. I just wanted to say thank you so much for everybody that came out today. Great questions, and I look forward to working with the community more. Thank you to Legal Foundation of Washington for making this possible also.